Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. It's my real pleasure to have all of you here because this is not only most interesting when it comes to the content, but also a kind of family party that we are having here. And you will, if you don't know it yet, you will certainly find it out during the evening that many people in this room are linked to each other for very many different reasons, research projects, personal reasons, in situ summer school, whatsoever. And more or less everybody here on the panel, but also many people in the room do have a common history of research and teaching and fun in ICT-related issues of the law. My only role is to say this. Everything else was organized by others here. I just need to mention, if I may, 2 or 3 people who are mainly in charge of everything here today. That's Ioannis, who is taking care of the whole summer school and who is not sleeping for 4 weeks, I think, because he's constantly working on this. Then it's Dennis Heinemeyer, who is outside, who takes care of the technical setup. So you might know that this is streamed on the internet. By the way, you don't need to worry about any privacy-related issues because it's only the panel that is to be seen, not you. And I would suppose that they have given their informed consent. Probably not in writing, but at least they have given an informed consent when doing so. If not, we could stop it now. But we will not do so. But that would change the party, I can see, if we do. And the third person I would like to mention, actually there are 2 more. The third person is really Seehausen, sitting in the back here, who is here for the Alumni Association of our ULIST program, which is the LL.M program. And there is a long tradition that those kinds of meetings and events are organized together with them. And I'm very happy that he, representing the institution, is here. And the 4th person, finally, is Sylvia Jakob, who's sitting here in front because she is doing all the content-related work. So thank you for doing so. Thank you for being here, in particular the panel, which is most diverse, as you will certainly find out in a minute, and still very, very connected to this institution here. Thank you for being here, and I wish all of us a very nice evening. Enjoy it. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to this year's special edition of the Institute's Forum IT-Recht. This time dealing with the more current topic of transnational data flows and struggle for privacy. Will data protection law face the challenge of the digital era? To give you a bit of background information, the international transfer of personal data is a phenomenon that has grown exponentially with the advent of the internet and the increased globalization of the world economy. In the 1970s and 80s, for instance, transport data flows largely took place within closed networks. The cost of internet access was so high that only large corporations and governments could take advantage of it. Nowadays, however, the internet is easily accessible and full of free applications and services. So this development on the one hand side promotes economic growth and efficiencies, but on the other hand exposes the privacy of individuals to new and increased risks, in particular the risk of unwanted surveillance. How should the law deal with these issues? And how can the law deal with these issues is a question which is not as easy to answer, since cyberspace is an independent and borderless era where the implementation of the norms, for instance, of the data protection law cannot always be taken for granted. So in order to learn more about this field, we have the privilege today to attend a panel discussion with 3 prominent experts in this field. First, there will be Mr. Rubens Menezes, who is from Brazil and was a participating member of In Situ in 2010. He holds an MA in social history from the University of São Paulo, where he's currently also working on his doctoral thesis entitled Owners of Ideas, History and Conflicts of the Droit d'auteur, Copyright and Patents in the Contemporary Crisis of Capital, from the Uruguay round in 1986 to the pirate parties in 2006. In addition, Mr. Menezes teaches computer science and internet-related technologies at the FATEC São Roque, a public technology college in São Paulo. He will thus start the panel discussion by giving us some insight into the technical and social background of the phenomenon. How does the internet enable transnational data flows, and what social effects ensue? Thereafter, we have the great pleasure to hear from Professor Dr. Christopher Kuner, a leading expert in the field of international privacy law. He's the author of several books and dozens of articles, being the editor-in-chief of the periodical International Data Privacy Law published by Oxford University Press. He was also active in many international organizations, such as the Council of Europe, the OECD, and UNCITRAL, and is currently a member of the expert group on the retention of electronic communications data set up by the Directorate General for Home Affairs of the European Commission. And you may forgive me if I do not mention all the other awards and activities Mr. Kuner has been involved in and has won. But he's clearly the person to ask when it comes to transnational data flows. He will thus give us a comprehensive talk on how the transfer of personal data across national boundaries is regulated under data protection and privacy laws. Last but not least, we will hear from Christian Hawellek, who studied aerospace engineering at the University of Stuttgart and law at the Leibniz University of Hannover, with a focus on German and European IT law and German and European economic law. He has been a research associate at IRI since 2010 and has been working on various projects addressing data security issues together with the private sector, including ICAR, DFB, Volkswagen, and others, as well as many European Commission funded projects addressing legal questions relating to security, privacy, and law in order to help the Commission to shape future legal frameworks regarding smart surveillance, cross-border data exchanges, social costs of surveillance, economic costs of surveillance, with the aim to balance security needs and privacy protection. For the organizational procedure, I would like to ask you to first listen to the speakers, and then we have a general discussion after every speaker has spoken, in order to have to get on with the time. I would like to ask to give the word to you.
Guten Tag. It's a real pleasure to be here. Good afternoon. I am, as was mentioned, I'm a former in situ member, and it's an amazing privilege to be here today. And I am, when I was accepted in situ, it was kind of a surprise for me, because I was telling Professor Frogel the other night, there was only two strict requests to apply. You have to be a lawyer, and you have to be a citizen of the European Union. And I wrote that to them. I'm not exactly European and not even a lawyer, but I would really like to go there and participate, and I was accepted, and I really thank you for that, because here we are today. I'm closing a cycle. It was really important for my PhD. And on this subject of data protection, I want to first a word about privacy, with this idea of nothing to fear and nothing to hide. I want to open with a quote, a very famous quote that probably many of you have heard before. That's from Mr. Eric Schmidt, former Google CEO, that once he said, if you have something you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing that in the first place. And that's an idea that keeps popping up in every discussion, and it's frighteningly resembles a declaration of General Augusto Pinochet, when he said, "I remember you of a saying, gentlemen, the one who does nothing has nothing to fear. As a consequence, if they did nothing, they should not have that much fear of the intelligence service." And the connection between these two declarations in my mind is the Article 12 of the Declaration of Human Rights, where the right to privacy is a human right. And I will make a pause here, and I'll get back to this subject later. I want to now talk about how the web works. I'll tell you, in a way, not the really technical details, but I want you to should have a basic understanding of something that is important about the data that is recorded about you when you are online. So initially, when you first connect to the web, your provider, your internet provider, will attribute an IP address for you, an internet protocol address that will, when you have the, of course you can have a fixed IP address, but in this example it's a random IP address. This provider give you this number that's kind of your ID on the internet. With this ID, you can go to the application provider. You can have the web pages, you can have pictures, videos, everything, and this server, the web server that's giving you the stuff, in this picture it's an Apache web server. It will record everything it has given to you. But it does not really know who you are. He only knows that that number asked for that specific material. On the other hand, your internet provider knows the number you are using, but it cannot know, ideally, when the things are set up correctly and we're not talking about the same provider, it will not know what you have seen. So it knows you've been logged from this time to this time, but it's not aware of what you were doing. On the other hand, the application provider will be aware of what you were doing, but does not really know who you are. It does not have your billing address or information about you. So it's kind of a perfect world, because on one side you are connected, on the other side you have received information, and they can't really connect the two things. Problem, of course, that we hardly live in a perfect world, and eventually these two data can be matched. When this data can be matched, everything about you will be common knowledge for the verifying institution who will be connecting these two data information. So your political views, sex orientation, what you have seen, what you have done online, every step that every click of mouse will be easily tracked back to you if you have these two information together. Everything. And when I say everything, I'm not saying it's not the Facebook or the Google everything. It's a metadata, because the Facebook and Google everything about you is really detailed data. This data is metadata. It's that information about the information. It's plain, simple, and innocent data about data. And I hardly believe that there is such a thing as metadata. There is no such a thing as metadata. It's a misconception in my opinion. Data is data. All data can be tracked back to you. You only have to have the knowledge to do that. So that's one assumption that I wanted to share with you. And okay, but does privacy matter? What you're doing online, is it even important? Because some people will say, oh, I'm doing nothing wrong, there's nothing there's no problem for that. Until we heard about Edward Snowden and his revelations, a lot of people were not paying attention to that, not even the governments. And about governments, I want to talk briefly about the Brazilian government. We got an interesting position in the United Nations. We were the first country to adhere to the United Nations, to sign the creation of the United Nations. And as a tradition, Brazil opens the first speech in the General Assembly. And when the Brazilian representatives that do that, usually summarize the problems of the moment, and we'll give, of course, the Brazilian perspective on that, but it's kind of an introductory speech that will follow all the other speeches. And on 21 of September 2011, The president, Dilma Rousseff, was the first woman to open the General Assembly of the United Nations. And she had a message for the United States at that moment because of the Snowden affair. At that moment, she got a diplomatic trip arranged with the United States. They were going to, she was going to meet Obama, and it was called off, and it was not realized until today. The relations between two countries became very shaken because of we came to find out that Brazil was a specific target of the North American espionage, and that the company, the petroleum company of the country, Petrobras, was one really big target on the whole scam. So she gave this declaration, and at the moment when she did that, I loved it, the declaration. I was, oh, that's exactly what I think. That's perfect. And it was this idea that without privacy, there is no chance of democracy. There's plain simple like that. That's another point that I'll get back in the end. Now I want to talk about the free software factor. We got in Brazil. It is a big country. Brazil is a big country when it comes to free software, because when the Workers' Party started to grow in Brazil and to win cities and to win regions, and finally the federal government, the initial militants of the party, they were involved in free software. So they started to implement free software. Every time there was a winning an election, they started to implement free software. When it came to Lula's election in 2000, I think, it became a state policy to implement free software all around. And the ideas of free software were part of the government. And what are those ideas? Those are the ideas of the 4 freedoms that start with a 0, and that because hackers think different. They don't start to count on the 1, they start to count on the 0. And these 4 freedoms, they are, every time I got a chance to sleep it in a presentation, I do sleep in a presentation, but they are fundamentally personal freedoms about what you can do. And this idea was really present inside the Brazilian government for a long time, until we start to create some kind of left-leaning free software with political views that were never imagined by Mr. Richard Stallman when he started the free software movement back in the United States. To a point where in Brazil it started to be identified as a left-wing thing, the free software. And then something happened. A famous Brazilian TV show, TV person, that was a former girlfriend of Ronaldo, named Daniela Sicarelli, was caught on video in very intimate moments in a beach in Spain. Notice nothing of the things I will tell you now happened in Brazil. She was recorded in Spain by an Italian paparazzi using a Japanese camera. That's globalization, right? And she was news back then. And a Spanish TV aired the scenes and in Spain. But they got to YouTube, and all of a sudden they were all over Brazil, and something really interesting happened. Daniela Sicarelli and her boyfriend asked the judge to remove the videos. Then Google said it was not possible to do that, because you have to pinpoint what's the video you want to cut. And then the judge received it. The judge are not used it to be contradicted, and they said to block YouTube in Brazil. just like that. And it was done for 4 hours, I think. And then the uproar on the society was so big that the judge thought, no, no, you read it wrong. I didn't say to block it. It said to do something, but don't block the thing. And then they retracted. But what's the point of this little story? The point of the little story is that what was happening in Brazil by the time? All judges were giving this kind of totally crazy decisions and different decisions about whatever you could imagine. So these people that was used to free software and was in the government, they started one idea, a civil landmark that we call in Portuguese Marco Civil. It was a law made as free software, made in public, on the internet, with collaborations of everyone who could enter the website and write their opinions. And when I say everybody, I include the American Embassy and the Argentinian industry of music industry. All of them want to say how the law should work. And in the end, it was a really good law, because it was a law made to guarantee the rights of the users and to order the decisions of the courts. So you get freedom of expression, protection of privacy, protection of personal data, network neutrality, just the best intentions possible. And this law just have to go to the parliament and then be sanctioned by the president, and it would be our day by day. But this law was the law that would never be. At the time, it was the end of term of Lula's presidency, and we started to Dilma Rousseff, and the political scene changed, everything changed, and everybody that was involved was totally sure that we would never see this law made unreal. And then the Snowden effect happened. And it was a rush to give an answer. And in 23 of April, it was made as a real law. The question, or maybe the problem, is that the law carries 3 bugs, 3 little bugs. And one of these bugs is Article 13, that will state that the administration has a duty to keep the connection records for a year. So that first guy, the internet provider, now, today, by Brazilian law, is forced to keep all connection logs for a full year. The second bug, Article 15. Article 15 will say that the application provider have to do the same for 6 months. So you got on one side logs of whenever you've been online for 1 year, and the other side of whatever you have seen for 6 months being guarded by law. That's problematic, but it's really problematic when you see the third bug, Article 22, that you can request for those logs if you feel somehow that you deserve to have access to those logs. And what's the problem of that? The problem of that is that when you put this Article 13, 15, and 22 together, you got exactly the thing that Dilma was saying in the United Nations that was wrong for the NSA to do. That's exactly the same thing that NSA was doing, and maybe even worse, because there is a feel of illegality to them. While we now have this strange situation in Brazil that we have, it's blocked by the force of law. And what I want to point to that is that we're kind of, the whole world, entered a dark and dystopian scenario. not seen by even by the most, not even by the literature. So my message would be that the sooner we accept that we are under surveillance, will be better, because we can fight for privacy. Privacy is a precondition for democracy. We can't have democracy without privacy. If we feel that we are being watched or our actions are being recorded, we will not act as we should act or as we would have acted. And the problem, the most terrible problem this kind of thing creates in my, this data retention creates in my head is that it's a time machine. Because you don't have to have a, of course, the law enforcement should prosecute crimes and investigate crimes. But in the normal states, it happens after the crime is committed. The investigation begins after the crime. If you keep the logs, if there is data retention of everything, the state will be in possession of a time machine. It can go back in time and search for what you have done. And if the logs are present and they are searching for what you have done, they can find even things that they were not looking for. So it's extremely bad for democracies, and it's eroding civil liberties in many ways. So my dark message is that I really think people should keep in mind that we're entering a world of massive, endless data retention everywhere, and there should be legislation fighting that. It's really important to have legislation that do not allow the data to exist in the first place. That's really important. And you should remember there is no such a thing as metadata. Metadata is real data. It's important data that can tell a lot of things about a lot of people, about you. So when people just say, there is no problem to record metadata, you can answer, oh, that's cool, so let's delete it. If it's not useful, let's delete the metadata. And there is this idea there is no possible privacy with computers now, but we should turn to cryptography. If many of us start to use cryptography, you put a burden over the spies. Probably they can break the cryptography, they can see whatever you are doing, but we will have a burden on them. And the final thing I would like to say to you is that the part that Europe played is really important. There is no way we can face that in South America. The countries from where this data retention came, they are too strong. The only way we can fight that is when we have partners in other countries fighting that. And here in Europe, you have last week a great victory on that. And since I've been here, I've been watching how Germany works with that, and I just love the way you don't like data to be present in the hands of government. And I'll end with the sentence of President Rousseff about why privacy is important and why we should not allow companies and governments to hold a lot of data about us, even if they say it's metadata. And that's it. Thank you.
Shall I just continue with Mr. Kuner?
Right, well, thank you, first of all, very much that you're all here to listen to me and for the invitation. It's quite an honor to be here at the university that's named after one of the greatest thinkers ever, Leibniz. I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in organizing this. Thank you for the kind introduction, Mrs. Jakob and Professor Forgo too, and everyone connected with the Institute. I'm happy to, and also greetings to all of you who may be watching the internet, I should say too. I'm very happy to be asked on a topic here, on a topic today, which I think is quite important, namely the territorial scope of EU data protection law and regulation of transborder data flows as they relate to the internet. This is, I think, a fairly broad topic, and it's not always easy to try to focus it well. I will try to do that and keep it interesting. I think I probably won't want to subject you to more than 45 minutes of listening to me talking about this. I also do not have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to be talking to you. I think this is a topic, however, which is of crucial importance for the information society, and therefore I hope it's interesting. I come at this topic from a legal angle, so unlike my colleagues on the panel, unfortunately I don't also have a scientific or computer science background, so perhaps my remarks may be a bit limited in that sense, but I'll again try to make them interesting. I've dealt with this topic in different ways as a lawyer since the 1990s, as an author, as an academic, and I'm going to try to give you both a big picture of the main themes and also maybe go into a little detail. The topic here we're talking about really is about application of law, what law should apply on the internet, how can people be protected on the internet. If we think of this as private international law, then I recall famous words made in an article in 1951 by William Prosser, who wrote that private international law is a dismal swamp filled with quaking quagmires and inhabited by learned but eccentric professors who theorize about mysterious matters in a strange and incomprehensible jargon. I will try to avoid that, and I think indeed what I will speak about is interesting enough that I hope it keeps your interest. It also has great practical relevance. If we, again, defining the topic as protection of digital rights or data protection rights on the internet, we can recall, for example, all companies now routinely transfer data internationally because they use the internet, and the internet is set up technically not to be focused on national boundaries, which are a legal construction. Users access websites all the time, probably in most cases without caring or knowing about where the service is located. They just want to use a particular service with some urgency and may not care so much or even know that. We have to also remember this isn't just about companies. Public authorities do a lot of data transfer, and in fact there's a huge, this is maybe an interesting topic at some point for the Institute, there's a huge body of data transfers going on all the time by public authorities about which there's very little is known, and I'm not talking just about intelligence, but very routine matters of public administration, customs, social security, tax information, etc. And it's very hard to penetrate this. I tried to look into this a bit from my latest book, and I realized quickly it's a bit too dense, but this has just become ubiquitous. And it's something that happens all the time in our daily lives. I think we know that. We're also talking about here how far does the protection of EU law extend on the internet. Now, we lawyers know the importance of trying to answer this question very early on or at the beginning of a legal analysis. Which law applies? It's the most basic question, foundational question for analyzing any legal issue. Unfortunately, it's not, that's sometimes forgotten, but it's very important. It's also become a key issue for economic and societal development. Having a clear, workable data protection privacy framework, it's crucial for protection of fundamental rights, but also for the development of our society and our economy. At the moment, we can observe, I think, a frustration with this area, which is, I think, the reason we're having this panel today, is there's a lack of clarity and a lot of frustration on the parts of the various stakeholders. So individuals are confused. They don't know what protections they have on the internet. They often don't know what rights they have, and they don't know to whom they should turn if their data are processed. And of course, the fact that their data are routinely now processed in different countries and different regions makes it even more confusing. You may know if you have to go to German Consumer Protection or Data Protection Authority, that's one thing. If you're in Germany and you have to go to Brazilian authority, that's a lot more difficult, just to use one example, or any authority in any third country. Companies are also frustrated by having, first of all, a lack of clarity as to what law applies to their online activities, also by having multiple laws overlap to those activities, and then by having conflicting legal obligations, something that is very common nowadays, in particular EU law saying do X and the law of another country or region saying no, you have to do Y. And I think, speaking to regulators, they're also quite frustrated because they have the job of enforcing the law. We know that this has been amply documented, that they lack resources, both monetary and personnel resources, and they also run up against limits as to enforcing their law outside of the territorial boundaries of their country. So I think it's also frustrating if you're a regulator and you cannot provide recourse to your citizens who may be coming to you with problems. I think even beyond the legal issues, what we're talking about here really determines how EU data protection law interacts with the wider world, and thus how data are protected in the global context. I'm using the term data protection already, and I haven't defined it. It's basically protection of an individual's personal data. I think maybe not everyone here in this room absolutely has a law degree, but you're all either lawyers or very familiar with the legal topic, so I won't hesitate to throw in a little bit of jargon every now and then. I thus think that the questions we're discussing on this panel, as was amply demonstrated, really influence the future structure of the internet. So this isn't just a technical legal topic. We also see frustration with this lack of protection or confusion about it, fueling different initiatives, which are already maybe starting to fragment the internet and promote local and regional internets rather than a global internet. And I can refer here to, for example, requirements that data be stored locally rather than allowing it to be stored around the world. I'm going to be concentrating on the EU, but this is a topic with global relevance. We also have to remember EU data protection law sets the standard for the world. There are nearly 100 countries worldwide with EU standard data protection laws. I know from traveling in other regions that what happens in Brussels with regard to EU data protection laws is looked at very carefully. And I think the EU has the most sophisticated and long-standing body of data protection law, so it's naturally looked to as a leader. Of course, at the moment, we're now in the process of revising the law, and also new laws are being enacted around the world all the time, which will even complicate what we're talking about here. Now, I should also say I'm not going to talk in detail about the Snowden revelations and data access by intelligence services for several reasons. I think other speakers on the panel will deal with that. The facts are a bit unclear. I feel a bit uncomfortable as a lawyer giving a legal analysis for something that I'm not sure exactly precisely what's happened. I should say too, this doesn't just involve the NSA. There are many other countries, as is apparently the case, that are either collaborating with the NSA or have similar activities in their own country. I recall very vividly in the 1990s being in Paris and telling a friend of mine who was a very well-connected French lawyer, I have to go now and make a business call about something very sensitive. And he said, well, in France, if you want to discuss something sensitive, I wouldn't do it over the phone. And this made an impression on me. And I think what we've seen come out in the press has confirmed these sort of, it seems to be a global phenomenon that countries are just accessing data without much limitation. There is, of course, work going on at the international level to try to clarify all this at the UN. I'm not going to go into that much either. I think that would be too detailed. I will say maybe just a couple of words further about this issue of law enforcement access at the end. I've tried to divide my talk into 5 main sections. I'll try to go through them fairly rapidly and without going into too much detail. I will first give you a brief high-level overview of EU rules that already exist with regard to the territorial applicability of data protection law. I'll then discuss some general normative issues and considerations. Third, I will discuss some practical issues. Fourth, then, I will discuss a bit the current reform of the data protection framework by the EU, and then some recent Court of Justice of the EU cases that have gotten a lot of attention. And then finally, I will draw a few conclusions. So starting off, what are the current rules that we have? And it's important in order to understand are they adequate or are they not. I think that EU data protection law became a serious legal topic in 1998 when the Directive 95/46 came into force. There were data protection laws before that, but they were mainly of national relevance. And so the directive really raised up the profile of data protection law around the world. At the time, there were 2 main sets of questions that needed to be addressed by the directive with regard to applicable law. First of all, how do we allocate applicable law within the EU? And then the second issue, which I think is more relevant maybe for my talk, how can we protect EU data that is being transferred to other countries or maybe accessed from other countries? There was already a lot, I discovered this in my research, in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of data transfers going on, but as has already been said, these tended to be either in closed networks, they tended to be done between governmental authorities. So a lot of the routine transfers I've spoken about already. And then, for example, if you wanted to make an airline or a hotel reservation, you couldn't go onto the web and do it. You had to go to a travel agency, and then they had an internal network with other travel agencies and hotels, and they would do it for you. The directive is the first major data protection instrument to include applicable law rules, which is by itself, I think, significant. What are the rules? Well, this would bore you to tears and would immediately you all start to leave if I went into detail about it. So all I can say is to try to compress this into about 30 seconds. With regard to the processing by data controllers established in the EU, it's basically the law of the member state of establishment of the controller that applies. And then if the data controller is established outside of the EU, so think of a non-EU website, for example, EU law still applies if the controller uses what's called equipment, meaning either physical or virtual equipment within the EU. And in practice, this means that EU law will already apply if the data controller uses certain online technologies that can result in the tracking of individuals, most famously the so-called cookies, which are small text files that are put on your hard disk. At the same time, the directive also restricts the transfer of personal data outside the EU to countries that lack what is called an adequate level of data protection. These are what I would call the transborder data flow rules of the directive. As I will say in a minute, I think that these data flow rules are actually also a kind of applicable law rule because they follow the same purpose, which is to extend the protection of EU law outside the EU. And there are various legal bases to satisfy this test under the directive, which I won't go into, having an adequacy decision of the European Commission as to the country of destination, consent using contractual clauses, etc. So this is our current framework in the EU. Now, many people become sort of obsessed by this and immediately go into detail about it, but I think it's important to step back a bit and ask ourselves, what is really the purpose of these rules? This is the general standard for interpreting legislation anyway under EU law. And I've noticed a lot of data protection regulation that's been enacted without clearly articulating its purpose. And many of the explanations given are, I would say, tautological. So you might say, why do we want to restrict data transfers outside the EU? And the answer might be, in order to protect data. And then you might say, yes, but how does it protect data? Does it actually protect data in practice? And what do you mean exactly? So if we try to go beyond that first step and go a little more into the substance, as I said, I think that these are basically another form of applicable law rule. Mechanisms for transferring data outside the EU routinely require the application of EU law to this data processing. Whether this works in practice is another question. So the purpose of both the applicable law rules I've described and the transborder data flow rules is basically the same. What are the reasons for these rules? Well, I've tried to identify them in my latest book, and I found really 4 of them. First of all, avoiding circumvention of the law. So we don't want, if we have strict rules for processing data in the EU, we don't want people to suddenly say, aha, I can transfer this data to China and then do whatever I want with it. That would be seen as circumventing the law or evading the law, and therefore we have these restrictions. Guarding against data processing risks abroad. It's seen now that maybe processing data in other countries could be more risky. There may be easier access by intelligence services, although I wonder if that's really the case given everything we learned under Snowden. And then allowing people to assert their rights more easily. It's certainly easier to assert your rights to your data in the EU because we have a legal framework for that. There are instruments in place if you're in one member state and you want to assert your rights in another member state, whereas that's not so easy if you're in a third country. And then enhancing confidence. To some extent, it seems that people might be, that the confidence in using the internet might be undermined if there was no way to maybe stop or at least restrict certain types of data transfers. Now, if you keep these reasons or objectives of the law in mind, you might say, what are some of the conceptual questions that they rise, or maybe problems? Well, I think there are several, and I will just name a few of them. First of all, the first thing you would think if you were looking at a provision to restrict a data transfer, you would probably say, aha, I have to find out what is a data transfer, and that must be defined somewhere. Well, it isn't defined anywhere. So it's not in the directive, it's not defined in the regulation proposed by the European Commission to replace the directive. And therefore, all of us who work in this area are sort of left sometimes speechless, trying to, when we're asked, can't you tell me what is a data transfer? There was a case of the Court of Justice in 2003, the Lindqvist case, which tried to grapple with this issue and put some limit on the extension of EU law to the internet, but it's not exactly clear what the value of that decision was and how broad it is. We also have something in the directive which exempts from the directive data processing for purely household or for purely personal and household activities. Now, this also gives rise to questions in the internet age. What about putting data or information on Facebook? Is that a purely personal or household activity? You could probably argue this either way. If it is, then it doesn't fall within the EU data protection rules at all. That would seem somewhat strange, however, given the risks that these sort of activities can hold. of course, it's also very difficult now to localize where does data processing take place. In order to apply these rules, you have to know where it takes place, and that's become very difficult in the internet age. It's also not even clear, is it really important anymore? Let me go on now to my next topic, sort of looking at the practical issues. How can these rules be applied in practice? How does this work? Well, there are a number of practical challenges when you look at this armory of EU applicable law and data transfer restrictions, challenges to applying them in practice. So first of all, these rules are phrased in a very broad way, and they tend to result in quite broad extension of EU data protection law. And in fact, in many cases, EU law seems to apply even in situations where there seems to be a lack of contact with the EU. So generally, I think in private international law, we have kind of a very basic idea that there has to be some sort of minimum contact or minimum relation with the forum, or it doesn't really make sense to apply our law. And I get these kinds of questions all the time in practice. For example, company in China has data of Chinese employees, and they of course want to process them in China, and then they want to outsource the storage of the database maybe in the EU to a company because they get a good offer maybe from a company here. Does EU law apply to that? It might not, but it might. Certainly I can imagine circumstances under which it would, and then you get the question, but this is about a Chinese company processing data of Chinese people in China. Why do we also have to apply EU law to this? And you get into some very complicated issues of applicable law. We also, in the EU, I think, have our system is now based on a lot of very legalistic mechanisms to apply EU law in practice. So we have contractual clauses, we have consent, we have binding corporate rules. These are all sort of procedural steps, and they can be difficult to implement, and at the end of the day you wonder, do we just have a lot of sort of paper-based compliance, or does this really provide protection in practice? Something that's also, I think, very worrying is that there's a large exemption in the directive for law enforcement data processing and national security. Basically, the directive doesn't apply to that. Now, we do have some other instruments that do apply in part, but we don't have a harmonized legal framework. So this immediately, I think, undercuts a bit some of the credibility of the law when you have major exemptions to widespread data processing. And then we have the question about some of the technologies used nowadays, like cloud computing. It can often be difficult to find a clear, easy legal basis for these kind of technologies under the existing rules, and I would say also under the proposed rules. We also see sort of a total clash between the business imperatives in the private sector and the law here, business being global. Many businesses organize themselves not under territorial basis, but under maybe the sector or the type of activity a part of the business is doing. But of course, the law remains very territorial. We also have a very great desire among regulators to extend the territorial scope of data protection law, and sometimes I think with a bit of a lack of knowledge of other areas of law. I had this discussion with regulators who wanted to force companies to agree to have audits of their data processing in other countries. For example, in South America, I can think of a case, and you have to say to them, well, you know, this could be a problem for you, because if you have a basic course in public international law, you know a regulator, administrative authority from one country cannot go just to another country and carry out their activities. They may even be arrested because this would be a violation of sovereignty. And this sort of thing, often there's a lack of knowledge about it. I would also suggest we don't have good quantitative data about how is data moving around the world. how much of it is moving around the world. We know that it's expanding greatly, but there isn't really a lot of hard research that's been done about that. My experience too is that to the extent that this is an issue, is an area for the private sector, it's of interest to large multinationals. So small and medium-sized enterprises, in my experience, are completely disinterested in this. I have some sympathy for that because they're, in many cases, trying to just survive from one month to another. But things like data flows, they have no interest in it at all. And many public authorities, I've also found this out without naming any, do a lot of data transfers, perhaps also without considering the legal rules. So we have a general, I think, a bit of a lack of understanding of the rules in the marketplace. Next section quickly, as I said, there's a reform of the data protection framework that was proposed by the European Commission in 2012. The framework recognizes that we do have problems with the current legal rules for protecting data of EU individuals abroad. The level of compliance with the rules is low and enforcement is also low. There are many exceptions that seem to apply to them. The nature of compliance can be quite bureaucratic. There's a lack of harmonization among member state implementations, et cetera, et cetera. The European Commission has proposed certain changes to the current rules, most noticeably to replace the directive with a regulation, which would be, at least in theory, lead to complete harmonization, and so it would at least remove the problems we have within different member states. I won't go into them, to these changes in great detail further. I can just say from my own point of view, I find them not to make really a fundamental change in the rules we have now, but to maybe refine them in certain ways. Now, we've had recently a number of very interesting decisions of the Court of Justice, which I think are of great interest to all of us who have to teach data protection law, and we're actually very grateful to them too, because they give a lot of interesting material for students to read and to discuss. One of the motivations of this has been, since 2009 in the EU, we have the Lisbon framework, which anchors data protection much more strongly as a fundamental right. It also includes the Charter of Fundamental Rights being given now very much higher and stronger legal status than it used to do. So I think these cases are kind of the fruit of that. There's the first wave of cases involving data protection since the Lisbon framework, and they're very sort of interesting, sexy cases. You know, many of these Court of Justice cases for data protection have been quite dull and very technical, but these are really interesting. There are two of them in particular, which I think I would be remiss not to mention here, that the Digital Rights Ireland case, the data retention case from April, the Court of Justice invalidated the entire data retention directive. Unfortunately, also the expert group I was in has ceased to exist because the legal basis for it, which was the directive, has also been invalidated. That case doesn't deal so much with data flows, but there's a very interesting paragraph 68 in it, I think will be written about a lot by academics. This paragraph seems to imply that the EU fundamental right requirements of supervision of data processing by an independent data protection authority could also apply to data processing in third countries. It doesn't really answer that question clearly, but it throws out this possibility and leaves it hanging a bit in the air. So it raises this question about the uncertainty, the current uncertainty of the extraterritorial application of fundamental rights under the Charter. And I think this especially if we look at the next case, the Google Spain case, which is a bit of a development of that, we will see more and more of this line of thinking appear in the court's decisions. The Google Spain case from May has been discussed so much and written about already so much, and it's only a few months old, that I don't want to go into it in great detail. I can only mention one or two points that are of relevance to these sort of global issues that I've been discussing here. First of all, the court took an expansive view of the EU, the requirements of Article 4 under the directive to answer the question, what is data processing by a controller established in the EU, and found that EU law applies when the marketing activities of an EU-based establishment of a controller are, it said, inextricably linked to the actual processing by another entity of the controller outside the EU. Basically what this means is Google Spain doesn't process search data by itself. It's a kind of marketing entity for the Google mothership in the US, and therefore Google said, EU law doesn't apply to us because we're not processing data in the context of a controller established in the EU. The court said, sorry, we don't accept that because what Google Spain does is inextricably linked in its marketing activities to the processing in the EU, and so it's kind of part of the same enterprise, and therefore we will deem you to be processing data in your EU-based establishment. What does this mean? Well, it could mean that the respective national laws of each member state where non-EU internet companies are established will apply to their processing by the non-EU parent company. And this already seems that it could apply EU law broadly to many non-EU internet companies that may not actually have a database in the EU. It's also interesting to me that in this case, the court didn't really talk at all about the limits of its territorial jurisdiction. It applied the so-called right to be forgotten to the entire internet. There's no real limitation in it. And for example, the Lindqvist case I mentioned before was barely really mentioned. And so to my mind, I've written also this in some blog entries, it seems to sort of apply this EU-based right to the entire internet, which is breathtaking. We have to see now how this works in practice. There's a postscript now and for another very interesting case that's coming. On June 18th, there was a decision by the Irish High Court to refer to the CJEU a case brought by the famous Austrian activist Max Schrems against Facebook. And so the court has basically referred to the Court of Justice the question of, is the US safe harbor compatible with the Charter of Fundamental Rights? I think that's what it gets down to. And this is in a way sort of, again, if you're a legal academic, I think it takes your breath away because it holds open the issue of, are all of these data transfer mechanisms we use compatible with fundamental rights? That's a very wide-ranging question. And I think this will also force the court to clarify more the geographic scope and the territorial scope of data protection law. So my last remarks, my conclusions, what is one to make of all this, all of these rules together? How can we draw them together and draw conclusions from them? Well, I would say we have created a world in economic and social terms which is globalized, and in many ways we like that. We like being able to travel all over the world, work in different countries, study in different countries, as many of you have done or are doing, and communicate with our friends, etc. However, we're also a bit conflicted about this. Legally, we're not completely comfortable with it. We don't want to give up our national and regional standards. Citizens just are not comfortable with doing that, and I fully understand this. And I think this tension is reflected in data protection law. We're rediscovering something that dates from the 1980s, which is the concept of informational sovereignty. This was, if you do research and you look in countries like Brazil, France, and Sweden, there was a lot of concern in the 80s about the sort of potential loss of sovereignty by having widespread transborder data flows and access of databases from outside the country. And somehow this concern seems to have dissipated since the 80s. And I think it's now coming back again. And it's seen much more that if there is massive access to data or transfers of data, this can have an actual impact on the kind of sovereignty of the state. The application of the territoriality principle, I think, is one of the also biggest issues. with regard to the internet because it just doesn't seem to fit anymore. Before, if you think back in the history of private international law, before we had the territoriality principle, we had something called the personality principle. So in many ancient and medieval civilizations, you were subject to the law of your tribe or of your religion. And we seem to have kind of resurrected that a bit in that current legal frameworks for privacy often provide that the protections of an individual's home country or home law sort of follow their data around the world as they are transferred. And to my mind, this is kind of a bit the same thing as a personality approach. I don't think, however, this is really workable approach in the internet age. We see a number of gaps in the legal framework that are causing considerable problems to create a coherent system, regulatory system. As I said, the directive does not apply to law enforcement, data processing. We have a huge hole in EU law, which is so-called national security. Under the treaties, this is a matter for member states. I have to say, too, it's also not even clear in EU law, what does this mean, national security? I've asked this question to people in the European Commission and some well-known EU law academics, and they sort of throw their hands up. It's not really defined. So at the minimum, we have to probably understand better what we mean by this. And I think we will have to move more to an EU framework for national security. We can't simply leave this all up to the member states. We also see greater calls for policymakers and data protection authorities to demand that EU data be protected as well in third countries as it is in the EU. For example, Commissioner Reding has said these sort of things many times. I wonder sometimes, are we not misleading individuals, citizens, when we say this, when we say, don't worry, we have all of these rules for protecting your data when they're transferred outside the EU. So whether the data are processed here or processed somewhere in Asia, you're protected. I don't think that's the case. There are limits to the scope of our law, and it may well be that in the internet, if we want a globalized world in economic and social terms, we have to accept that our law cannot protect us everywhere we go in the world, just the same as if you get on a plane to go to take vacation, your consumer law may not follow you all over where you go. You're going to be also subject to the law of the place where you are physically. And then some very final conclusions. First, I think that extending EU law to protect us extraterritoriality is understandable, but there must be limits to it, and this is what the Court of Justice has not yet done. They've been preoccupied with extending the scope of the law, but the question that follows that is to say, all right, but how far does it go? It must stop somewhere. This is not EU law is not a universal law that applies to the whole world. There must be some sort of limits to it. We don't really know yet what those are. Second, the Lisbon framework and the Charter of Fundamental Rights being given higher legal effect will, I think, have real effects on the territorial applicability of data protection law. We see this already in the Digital Rights Ireland case. And I predict that there will be a lot of surprises in Brussels, because I think frankly, there are probably not a small number of EU law instruments that if they were really looked at very carefully as to whether they're compatible with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, they may be found lacking. So we may see a number of instruments suddenly being declared invalid by the court, and that means the EU legislator also has to have a bit of a different mindset when they're enacting legislation. They have to keep fundamental rights much more in consideration. This isn't direct regulation of the internet, but it's kind of indirect regulation, because they're not maybe directly trying to regulate what happens in other countries, but they have to be cognizant that their legislation may be invalidated if it doesn't fulfill fundamental rights, and that can be quite embarrassing for them. Third, I think also governments and regulators should not suggest that individuals can be protected by EU law as well when their data are processed in third countries as when they are processed in the EU. There are simply limits to this, and to some extent, maybe we have to grow up a bit, and if we want the benefits of a globalized world, we have to take the downside of it, or the limits of it. I said in the beginning I would just say a couple of words about the law enforcement intelligent access, because I don't feel I can close without at least saying something about it. I'm a bit pessimistic that we will be able to produce legal rules for the extraterritorial applicability of data protection law that apply to the collection of data for intelligence purposes and that actually work in practice. The reasons are, first of all, there's no sign that national governments are prepared to subject their intelligence gathering to normal data protection rules. And this isn't just the US. I would suggest there's no sign that any government in the EU wants to subject their own intelligence gathering to normal data protection law. We also seem to have a complete lack of transparency with regard to exactly what is happening. We read books, we read articles in the newspaper about these revelations of Snowden, and sometimes the articles you read are a bit contradictory, or they don't, sometimes you're not sure always exactly what to believe, and I wonder how many people are there in the world who actually know exactly what is happening, how these intelligence services are cooperating, who is processing what data. I would suggest it's probably a very small number of people. So I think we may have to put up with a world in which intelligence services operate outside of the normal data protection framework. That's unfortunate because it seems hypocritical and it seems to undermine the viability of the law. I think two things that could help are to get finally a bit more transparency into all this, to know exactly what's happening, and then to have clarification of the impact of international human rights law on data collection for intelligence purposes. As I said, there is some work being done at this in the UN. Fifth, I also hope that the Court of Justice will keep in mind the issues of free flow of data and freedom of information. These are also internationally recognized civil rights. They're also recognized in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. The Google case, Google v. Spain, for example, doesn't mention this at all, and I find that a bit concerning. And then finally, I would stand by as a conclusion what I said at the end of my last book, which is I think we live in a world which is simultaneously fascinated by the benefits of globalization, the internet, and frightened by the insecurities they bring, determining the conditions under which data protection law can protect our data as they're transferred globally is one of the central regulatory questions for the information society. And the way that we finally determine these issues will reflect what kind of internet we want and what sort of world we want to live in. So I think I'm 5 minutes early, and with that I turn the floor back to Mrs. Jakob.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I will take a short break to record. I just started. So we will start over here again. And yeah, that works great. All right. Okay, so I will continue immediately. I hear we don't have a conflict break. I hope you have still some resources of listening to me. I'm going to address the subject a bit more from a different perspective, playing at least slightly devil's advocate. And I think that's a very interesting format here because we have a conjunction of the Forum IT-Recht and the Institute Summer School. And actually I have concepted that a bit more as a lecture for the Institute Summer School. So all the Germans in the rooms, please excuse me if I say some things about Germany as an example, which you already know. So this is now something which is very regional. Actually, this is the Harz Mountain. They're approximately 100 kilometers from Hannover in the south. A very beautiful range to walk in. And this is something which is Well, a memory of mine actually, because my grandparents come from there, and this is one of the higher mountains there, Boomberg, and that is the so-called NSA spy tower, which was part of the Latvian wheat system. This was installed very close to the former inner German border, which you see here. Is it? Can you see the images from the back? Is it possible? Yeah. All right. Because I have a feeling it's not as bright as it could be. However, so that's the former inner German border. That's probably that's the highest mountain. This is basically why the system was installed there, because Latvian wheat was one of the very first computer-based signal intelligence, SIGINT, that's a technical term, systems in the world in the 1970s with technology, among others, from IBM, and was designed to intercept communications from the Eastern Bloc, basically the GDR, of course, but also the other countries in the former Eastern European Bloc. So this is something which is simply related to this place, as the German border was not very far from Hannover. Many of these spy installations were very close to us. You could virtually see them. I remember when I was a small child, we were walking by. There were all these aggressive, great dogs guarding this thing, and people with machine guns. And to some extent that was scary, and to some extent that was very much part of the daily life in these mountains where my grandparents lived. You would stumble upon these sort of things all the time when hiking in the mountains. So now, coming back to the original subject, I would like to kind of explore for a start a few important differences, and these are mainly in the field between criminal investigation and threat prevention. So SIS, so Secret Intelligence Services, LEARS, this is law enforcement agencies, and the state prosecution have obviously different tasks, and they have obviously different objectives. And for that reason, they have different methods which they need to use, and therefore are governed by different legal frameworks. So keep that in mind, because that's what we're going to talk about now. So let's start with something relatively, well, I would say maybe a low impact crime, prophecy, these sort of things. What usually happens is that the crime occurs at a certain point in time, and afterwards it's detected, and then usually it would be investigated, and if the investigation is successful, you have the trial. This is the procedure of prosecution, obviously, and it's done by either the police or state prosecution, which with their executive powers. So now, there are of course situations where you don't want to act only when the harm has happened. This is just one example, the potential violent manifestation. So here you have a situation where you have a certain dangerous threat. And that means that there's a certain aggression, and for example, different parties, typically the far left and the far right wing, may start riots or whatever. And this suddenly means that the police here is entitled to do things which they would be not entitled to do in criminal investigation. For example, they can take the supposed extremists without having evidence, but just on a very light suspicion, into custody for a couple of hours, and then release them until the manifestation is over, when the manifestation is over. Or if we have football matches, we have the same, that sometimes people who are fans, supporters of one of the teams and make a violent impression, and there's already riots going on, they can be taken into custody. However, they cannot be arrested without a reasonable suspicion, because an arrest is something which happens in the criminal investigation in order to bring a case in front of court and a trial, and therefore you would need significant evidence. So this is an important difference. In the one case, you would like to have a certain danger not become real, a certain harm not to have happened, and in the other case, you want to investigate a crime when the harm was already done, so can no more prevent it. So I just wanted to make that clear, because you see it here on the flow of proceedings, that the prevention is pre-incident, whereas the prosecution is post-incident, obviously. Now, for this reason, the codes governing the two are completely different in many countries, and in particular in Germany, for example. So the Criminal and Procedure Code does allow to some extent the same measures as the Police Code for prevention of harms, but the conditions under which these measures are possible are way higher than they are here, because in the Police Code we would like to prevent the harm before it is done. So prevention obviously requires knowledge, and this knowledge needs to be prior to the incident, because you're here prior to the incident. So there's like basically two ways to get this. One is known circumstances, or places regarding which certain incidents are likely to happen. Manifestation, extremist political events, certain sports events. You simply know that these are environments where typically certain crimes can happen. However, there are other threats, even more severe threats, where you have an environment which is completely clandestine, which you need to get information about, and this is particularly the organized crime and terrorist threats. So you would say that the greater the danger is, the more important knowledge of the threat environment at an early stage becomes, and that of course affects the proportionality assessment. So the question whether a certain measure taken by a state authority would be proportional with regards to the fundamental right of the subjects which are affected by this measure. So if you now see the full scale, the full chronological flow of the proceedings, for example, for a terrorist threat, you would start here at a very early stage with strategic intelligence, so getting an idea about the security climate, operative intelligence, then handing this over to the police on a concrete suspicion to prevent the attack from happening, and afterwards there would be the investigation of the trial, but that's a completely different story. So gathering intelligence is something completely different than state prosecution, which is obvious, I think, but still I feel like in the public debate it's not really taken into account as much as I think would be necessary. So gathering intelligence means understanding the environment of threats to predict concrete threats, and therefore intelligence services usually, this does not apply for all countries, but I think it should apply for most or even all of the Western countries. No executive powers are assigned to the intelligence services because these are not secret police. This is not secret police, and they're not serving the criminal procedure. So what they do is that they collect information on non-suspects. And that's somehow clear if you look back or think back of this timeline, because at that point in time there are no suspects. And I feel this is important because my feeling is that very often in this discussion, one of the major arguments is, but they are collecting the data from all the people, even if they're not suspicious of having committed a crime. And of course this is an issue because this affects all our fundamental rights, but still you need to keep in mind the task we assign to our intelligence services and therefore their range of activity. So I just wanted to make that clear. So to kind of put a bit of flesh to the bones, now I said that in the beginning this sort of strategic intelligence, so you get an analysis of the security climate in a certain region. This is, for example, the famous square in Egypt, in Cairo, and you have a change of the situation. So this is mostly even open source intelligence, so this is basically analyzing the newspapers from the region in different languages and so on to get an idea of the shifts and movements in the security climate. For example, here this is the title, "The Arab Spring Moves into Fall," indicating that things were not, let's say, running optimally in all of the countries. So from there you would go and try to analyze a bit more concretely which are the threats which are there. This is obviously the region in Northern Africa, the Sahara region, where Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is operating, and this is this chart which I found on the web, I don't know how accurate this is, which kind of shows the social network, or anyways the network of Al-Qaeda on the one side and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb on the other side in the links. So this is a typical work in the field of intelligence to understand which are the links, and maybe from there onwards, or certainly from there onwards, on which of the individuals shown there to focus further in order to understand the threats which come from these organizations. So at this point in time, it may of course happen that the threat is coming to Europe, because all that is happening in Africa, and we have maybe also reasons to intervene there, some better, some worse. But if we come back to thinking of our police and prosecution and so on, we always have to think of the territory in which they are active and they are allowed to act, and this is certainly not a foreign country. So I just give you briefly one of the examples. This is these are chemicals which were ordered by the so-called Hawellek group. Some of you may have heard of that. It was a terrorist group which partly consisted of Germans and partly of people with a background from Arab countries. They were Islamists, and they planned an attack which was due to a certain amount of intelligence work and then of the police work here in Germany, who got the information from basically the American intelligence services and the different German intelligence services, who was arrested in the very end. So this is a very typical example in ideal circumstances how this should run. You analyze the general strategic situation, you get an idea of the threats, you analyze the networks, you know which are the contact persons in your own country, and then you can observe them, and if there's a a concrete threat of an attack, you can intervene there. So, what are the European security interests in the Maghreb? There's a couple of them. One important is trafficking, both human trafficking and drug trafficking. I will come back to that later. The second one is homeland security in the European Union. This whole Sahara region obviously is a very remote place, and it's extremely hard to control because most of it is part of so-called failed states. The only stable state in the region is Morocco. All the other states, I mean, Algeria is kind of more or less stable, and all the other states one could consider failed states, and they are also extremely poor. So you have vast regions of desert which you can almost not at all control, because you would need a large amount of technique and personnel to do so, and the governments do not have the resources. So you have the training camps of Al-Qaeda and Maghreb, and there's also the threat of potentially training the EU citizens there. There's currently, for example, over 200 Germans in Syria being trained on weapons there, and the same applies to some extent also for the Sahara. And the last point, the last security interest of EU is energy policy, especially now with the conflict in Ukraine, to get a bit of independence of Russia and the Gulf states. So, how are the relations there? You have a relatively small group of Al-Qaeda, this is only a couple of hundred people. And around you have associated Islamist groups, and around that you have organized crimes. These are basically marauding gangs, because there's literally no state control in the Sahara, as I said earlier. And this is a very suitable space to draw back to use as, for example, to store huge amounts of cocaine, which I will show you in a second. And around that, the outer layer is the casual criminals, because obviously it's a very poor region, and sometimes people tend to collaborate with the organized crime or even Al-Qaeda. So this is a chart from the International Center of Terrorism Studies, and here you see drug flows coming from Colombia and Venezuela. One way is north to the United States, and the other one is here to Western Africa, with a lot of distributors in the Sahel zone, and from there into Europe. And this is also kind of an open secret. This is part of the way of how Al-Qaeda is financing itself. There's donations and other means, and this is one of the important pillars on which financially Al-Qaeda and Maghreb is built. So, coming a bit more to a concrete example, this is the Western Sahara. This is an image which I've been taking in January of this year when traveling through the country, just to give you an idea how it's looking there. It's a largely vast country consisting completely of sand and desert. And now the question is, do you see anything particular on that image? I mean, it's not so easy to see anyway, but does anybody recognize anything in it? I think you nearly did, actually.
But there's a bit of plastic, right?
There's a bit of plastic. It's a landmine, precisely. It's a landmine. So this is how it looks if it has not lying in the ground. It's an Italian landmine. I could talk a bit about it because it's a very vicious device, but I don't think this is the subject here. But what I wanted to add is that this is one of the most densely mined countries in the world. There's about 10 million landmines in this country, which is, I think, factor 20 more than there's inhabitants. And there was a civil war, some of you might have known, from 1975 onwards. Prior to this was a colony, Spanish Sahara. Then there was, from the early 17 onwards, a left-winged, rather intellectual liberation movement, Frente Polisario, which tried to drive out the Spanish, which they did successfully, but afterwards the country was invaded from both Morocco and Mauritania in 1979. The Polisario defeated Mauritania, but Morocco occupied the country more and more, whereas with the ceasefire in 1991, only a small strip on the western border, and the eastern border to Mauritania remained to Polisario. And this was where there's a wall of defense which has found its way to the media several times, which very much reminds me of the inner German border. It's almost 3,000 kilometers long and guarded by approximately 200,000 soldiers. Can maybe distinguish it here going up there. And on the eastern part, in the no man's land, in the desert, there's the refugee camps of the Western Sahara, directly in the Sahel zone. So, coming back to the landmines, this is why I was showing this. This is a United Nations chart of landmines in certain regions where the refugee camps are. So it becomes obvious that this is a very hard life because there's virtually nothing which people can do to gain their living on there. They are completely isolated from the rest of the world. The Western countries are supporting them only reluctantly due to this socialist background of the Polisario. There's lots of landmines. Obviously, it's a desert. There's no agriculture. The access to the sea where the fishing took place is barred. So now you have here the refugee camps around Tindouf, which is on the southwest of Algeria. And this is how it basically looks like, just to give you an impression how this life in the desert is. There's, from my knowledge, approximately 100,000 refugees living there. They speak about 180,000 here. I don't know that precisely, but something in this region, right? So now thinking back of this operation field of Al Qaeda and Maghreb, you see up there the Western Sahara, this with a little corner on the left side. This is where the refugees camps are, and you have in mind the situation I just described. So even if the Polisario, which still has quite some influence over the refugees there, has to this point in time refused to become allies with Al Qaeda and Maghreb, at least in the outer circles, in terms of organized crime and casual criminality, there are strong links. And this is a fragile situation because you cannot know if there's 100,000 people living in that conditions, whether they will not change their opinion about cooperation with such an organization at some point in time. So how to get information about the security state there? One is, of course, using the Western organizations which are working there. For example, from the United Nations, there's CEETEPS, and it's a human rights association of the United Nations and a couple of NGOs. But obviously, this is only one way and a very limited way to get information out of the refugee camps, especially as the West is not particularly active there. So another one is to survey the telecommunication cables. And it's not a secret, or it's an open secret at best, that among the two regions which are most heavily observed by, for example, the German Foreign Intelligence Service, there's Pakistan and Afghanistan, obviously, and the other one is the Western Sahara. So if you look at this, is a map of all the fiber optic cables connecting Africa to the rest of the world. And you see there's not very many of them, and they're not going to the central region of Africa. So one way to monitor all the telecommunication there is, of course, the fiber optic cables, but there's even a better one. That's an image Magdalena has taken when we were in Western Sahara in general. That's a satellite dish. Because for most parts of the Sahara region, the only telecommunication links to the outside world is satellite connections. And this is why, for example, the Germans we have inherited this, by the way, from the NSA a couple of years ago, a very sophisticated satellite monitoring system in Bad Aibling in Bavaria, which is used to monitor all the telecommunications going over the satellite downlinks. Because the uplinks, both are basically very focused. It's microwave, actually. But the downlinks have a sort of a scatter, which you can, with a very sensitive equipment, pick up and then analyze. So that's very much kind of the 2014 version of what I was showing from the 1970s in the very beginning. So to conclude that, I would finally have some words on the legal framework on that. So what I'm talking about here is the so-called strategic intelligence. Why is it strategic? Strategic signals intelligence. Why is it strategic? Because you're not monitoring a particular person, but you're monitoring a complete downstream from a satellite, all the telecommunications which are going through. On touchscreen, obviously, there's no European legislation which particularly addresses strategic signal intelligence. And there's also a relatively simple reason for that, because intelligence services are not regulated by European law at all, because the treaties don't allow such regulation at that point in time, because that's national security, and all the governments are very keen on not handing these competencies over to Brussels, at least up to this point. So what I would like to do is to have finally a short look on the German law, because Germany is one of the very few countries having a relatively detailed and explicit codification of strategic signal intelligence proceedings. So there are two norms. It's paragraph 5 and 8 of the so-called G10-Gesetz, but this is not the most important thing. What is regulated there is that German Foreign Intelligence Service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, is entitled to filter international telecommunications for patterns in both fiber optic cables and the open sky. This is the satellite surveillance. And technically this works somewhat like an inverted automatic spam filter, so it's like looking for statistically relevant patterns and especially for keywords in the communications which goes through. So, but there's of course a limitation. I think this is what is interesting about it. This is limited to a couple of explicitly mentioned threads, so no application of this technology for anything else than what is listed there. So for example, the threat, this is basically all grave threats, and that's threat prevention. It's not criminal investigation or something. So it's about armed attacks on Germany, international terrorist attacks with direct relation to Germany, severe cases of proliferation of weapons of war, for example. This includes also nuclear technologies to kind of discover if German companies, which they tend to do at times, smuggle nuclear equipment into Iran or something like that. That's Iran or something like that. That's basically the kind of field of application. And there's a couple of safeguards which are implemented. I will not comment whether these are sufficient or not, but at least there are some safeguards in the law. Firstly, there's a control through the Federal Ministry of the Interior. Secondly, and most importantly, there's a control through the so-called Parliamentary Control Committee. This is a committee formed by representatives of all parties in the parliament, so with all political backgrounds controlling the surveillance measures conducted under this law. Secondly, or thirdly, the measure is limited to 20% of the entire capacity of the link, so you cannot monitor or observe everything which is going through, but only 20%. And it's limited to 3 months, and afterwards there's a mandatory reassessment of the necessity of this measure on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the threats for which it is used. So, and the second, this very similar thing applies on the necessity of evaluating whether storing the data which was gained from these links is still necessary for the purpose for which they were collected in the first place, and this has to happen every 6 months, and if the data is not necessary for this purpose anymore, it needs to be deleted. The question is, of course, how effective are such safeguards in a very secret environment, but there are at least some committees which are in charge of controlling that. How effective they are would be most probably a very interesting subject of a scientific study. So, final slide, Europe and surveillance. I've said you, or I've named you earlier the reasons why we do not have a European legal framework on the necessary safeguards, because the treaties do not allow it. There is, of course, a chance, or where the possibility, the theoretical possibility of extending the competencies of EU to national security of the member states. Whether this is politically feasible is highly questionable. And there's two other ways forward which come to my mind. The one would be an international treaty, and the other would be a COE convention. There are a couple of people thinking about such things. Whether politically they may become true is a completely different question, because sort of the intelligence services and the control over them seems to be the crown jewels of all the governments, and I'm not sure they're willing to hand that over. But at least we might find some, on the safeguard side, some harmonization in Europe in the future. Let's see that. So, to conclude all that, at least one positive message I have. This is the spy tower I was showing you in the very beginning. This is how it looked in 1993. So after the end of the Cold War, you see all the antennas have been stripped of that tower, and it was only a couple of months later that it was blown up, and today there's nothing else than a few blocks of concrete remaining from this story of the Cold War. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Okay, I would like to open the general discussion now. From what I have taken from this discussion from this panel, I understood from our first speaker that there's absolutely no democracy if there's no privacy. From our second speaker, I've understood that European data protection law cannot be indefinite, and the role of the law enforcement issues is not regulated by European data protection law, which then follows on to our last home speaker, Mr. Hawellek, who made us understand the need for surveillance. So really, the questions would surround on how to balance all these different interests. If you have questions, please.
Okay.
I would be very much interested about the stuff that Professor Menezes taught at the end of his speech. It was about the encryption of data, and as a lawyer, from a technical standpoint, how far you can go with the encryption to like burden the file, or is it even an option to, because they're already encrypted. So I don't know.
Probably I would recommend to always that whenever possible to encrypt the data. But I will also tell you that at the moment I'm finding all encryption tools and algorithms under severe suspicion of if they are even working. Because we have serious indications that we might be being fooled by the secret services, and then we're thinking that we are hiding stuff that they can easily open. But that's suspicious. We have to encrypt it whenever it's necessary, and probably we have to. It would be a good thing to encrypt it even when it's not necessary, because it will put a burden on the system. It will be a lot of unnecessary data being searched and decrypted, and we know that's time consuming and it costs a lot of money, and that machines, they'll have to make choices on what to read and what not to read.
Yes?
Related to that, it's more an open question to the entire panel. And we know that law has limitations that we won't be able to fix everything. So it would be preferable to have a solution up front, like for example, privacy by design, as an extra bonus to the law to make sure that we have an extra layer of protection.
I will give the word to each, and then that would be quite interesting. If you would like to start.
I think privacy by design is really difficult to achieve, and there are a lot of people working on that, and probably that's the path we will follow, but it's difficult to achieve. I don't know if it's feasible right now.
I think definitely yes, that the technical solutions and maybe procedural organizational solutions like privacy by design need to have a much stronger place in trying to resolve these issues, and also maybe to be given more of a legal value. Now, every time I say that, my friends who are computer scientists say yes, just as Rubens said, there are limitations, and I'm sure that's true. I don't think there's any panacea, but I think indeed we need probably a combination of legal protections, technological and organizational protections.
Sorry, can someone explain what is design?
Oh yes, sorry. Well, it's a concept that's been developed certainly in data protection law over the years, and it may have more specific meanings in other areas, but it basically just means build privacy into technologies when you conceive of them. It's rather than sort of waiting until there's a problem at the end and then trying to fix it. If you design procedures and technologies to be privacy friendly from the beginning, then they will process less data and there'll be less risk of violations. I think that's just a very vague general response.
That's the idea, but the problem in that is that there is a trust issue. You have to trust in the origin of the technology, and that's really difficult for a lot of people that works in technology. So we have to make really clear what are the constraints under which we will establish the trust. Because if, for example, if any company offers you a device or a solution or a software that says we have privacy by designing this piece of technology, but it's our intellectual property, so we are not telling you how exactly that works, it's a hell of a dilemma, because will you trust them?
Wait a second, 1 second. No, it's not quite finished. Can you hold it back for a minute?
I'll try my best.
Thank you. What do you want to say to that?
Well, I think privacy by design tends to be like a spotlight. You throw it into the discussion and it sounds good, but I think it's very difficult to actually assess what is meant by that, because I think it very much depends on the environment which you're looking at, on the objectives which you have. So, for example, can there be something like privacy by design in Facebook, where you basically throw out all your data voluntarily? Well, yes, to the extent where it means you get control over the data. And there can be privacy by design possibly in certain online services where lots of data is very easily accessible for third parties. However, what my impression is that most of the threats to privacy, especially in online environments, come from the fact that you have very different and very many different services running, interfacing, interlinking with each other, and they need to be compatible to each other. And there are lots of like gaps, or not to say vulnerabilities, where you can withdraw data. So in such environments, if you think of foreign espionage or of cybercrime, it will be way more difficult to establish a high level of privacy by design for your data. The last thing I would like to say to that is that well, that's a typical blackout. But I think it was sufficient anyway.
Sorry. Okay. So maybe two things here, but isn't trust always the case? I mean, if you buy a car and you get into the car, you can also die in this car, and you trust the producer that he will not do this eventually. So, I mean, we have a similar situation with the computers, but I think this is just a side remark. What I rather wonder is that if we argue that surveillance is needed, then the countries will not have an incentive to promote privacy by design, because let's say we introduce encryption to any email messaging, then of course we cannot filter and intercept communication if we're speaking about surveillance. And this is mainly to Christians, so is there something...
I wouldn't necessarily say so, because, I mean, at least, I mean, that might be a very German approach, but I kind of trust in governments finding proportionate and balanced solutions. And I wouldn't say that one was the best solution in the world, but at least there is a clear law defining the preconditions and the safeguards. There might be more, but it's at least it is in the law. And of course, you have the opposite situation, like in many countries where technologies to encrypt fall under the weapons law, and there's a very restricted access to encryption tools at all. And of course, this danger exists, but I trust, at least in the European environment, in the governments to be able to find proportionate solutions. So I wouldn't say that privacy design and a need to surveillance 100% contradict each other. They rather need to be balanced against each other.
Yeah. I think Mr. Hawellek's presentation was quite interesting because it's the same rationale that the governments use to collect mass data. So, but it's interesting and funny because they fail to predict the Arab Spring, they fail to predict the ISIS right now invading Iraq. How that used intelligence to legitimize the invasion in Iraq was wrong as well. So I don't think it's about terrorism or fighting terrorism at all. I rather think it's about spying on businesses. It's about economics. So I think it's sad. I don't think that we as citizens can do anything about it, but maybe big businesses can, because they have also an interest of securing their their secrets about certain technologies. And yeah, so my question is, since you, Professor Kuner, more often in Brussels, to what extent do you think can lobbyists working for big institutions and companies maybe fight for privacy laws?
Well, I think this goes to a point that's important in all of the presentations, which is a lot of the problems we're discussing really have nothing to do with privacy law. They're issues about governance and about the way the EU works. And yes, there is a lot of lobbying in Brussels. And I suppose in some ways the system has worked pretty well because we have you know, over the history of the EU, we've come up with a system that's preserved the peace in Europe, and it's given us a lot of prosperity, but there's also a lot of, I think it's far too incestuous and far too untransparent. I'm skeptical that there, for example, that let's say a group of lobbyists could just come in and completely change a legislative proposal. I mean, I think to some extent this is also this is a very convenient way sometimes for the people in the EU institutions to justify their failures, and we saw a bit of this with the data protection regulation, with some people in the European Commission blaming, and the European Parliament blaming lobbyists for things that maybe they weren't able to accomplish, and you know, that can be very convenient. I think we have a sovereign, we're sovereign governments in the EU, and if we want a legal certain legal structure, we can enact it. I don't think that there's really, I mean, maybe at some point, let's say before the German reunification, or maybe back years and years ago, there was much more of this kind of possibility. But I think really the problems, the main problems we have now are institutional governance, legislative issues that we have a kind of, it's very difficult to enact any sort of EU workable legislation now with all of the Euroscepticism. Yes, there is pressure from third countries, meaning the US. Yes, many times they're extremely inelegant, and they maybe make their opinions known in a very sort of strange and not always very pleasant way. But I don't think we can really push the responsibility off from ourselves. That if we want a certain framework, you know, if we want to have national security back in the EU treaties, we could do it. But there are political factors, and the problem is the UK, France, etc. would just never accept this, at least that I could imagine. And that's the first place we have to look, I think.
Yeah, just as you addressed me directly. Well, I think one of my major objectives in this presentation was not so much to justify it, but to show that there's two sides of the same story. And this is certainly right that in many cases intelligence has failed to deliver the information which the governments would have needed, but there are also a couple of success stories. And what I think should be the outcome of that is not necessarily that you would say it's completely good or it's completely bad, it should be unlimited or should be forbidden, but to kind of go into the proportionality assessment and think about to which extent do we find it useful and to which extent we don't find it useful. But I would not say that it's only useful for business espionage. I mean, this does happen as well, that's obvious, and there's like strong efforts in putting that down. I've seen a speech that they had of our foreign intelligence service, and he was talking about using the same technology I was describing to identify cyber threats to European networks. Whether this makes sense or to which extent it makes sense, I cannot assess, but it's kind of a new strategy they are taking actually.
Right. My question goes to Professor Kuner. Recently, two countries enacted legislations mandating internet service providers to localize data. Russia, I think last week or so, and Brazil did it some time ago. My question is, to what extent do you think this will be the norm? And to what extent will this also solve the privacy problem? And how is it possible in view of the borderless nature of the internet and how it works? How is it possible to achieve this?
Thank you, and for those of you on the internet, the question was about data localization initiatives. I think to some extent we're seeing a bit of maybe the scale is turning from having a completely global internet, as I said, to having much more of a regional one. And one of the examples of this are either legal requirements or incentives in certain countries to base data processing, to store data in the country. Now, I've been critical of this in my writings, and some of you may know that. So I'm skeptical of this, but I think from my mind, the first question which we haven't answered really is how effective would these measures be? I mean, I've read and spoken to computer scientists who basically say it doesn't really matter physically where the server is. If it's on the internet, it can still be accessed the same. I mean, from a legal point of view, of course, having a server in the country, or in one country rather than another, will have some legal effect because it means that the police in the one country where they don't have the direct authority to go in anymore. But I'm a bit skeptical because I don't think there's been a case made, or there hasn't really been hard evidence put on the table to show what is the actual concrete extra protection that these initiatives will give. I have to say I'm not familiar. I know that the Brazilian initiatives have been in the newspapers. I'm a bit more familiar with the Russian initiatives just because of cases I've dealt with. And the other thing that makes me skeptical is that this seems, at least in Russia, to have nothing to do with privacy. This is much more of a political power play. Maybe there are other countries where it is more honestly motivated by privacy protection. So I don't think at the moment that the case has been made really to show this as being helpful for privacy. But it's probably something that's going to continue, and we'll see more of these initiatives. Some may be more honestly focused on privacy, others may be more sort of having more of a hidden political agenda.
Can I just complete this about Brazil? There was this strong position from the federal government to, after the revelations, to make it mandatory to have the servers in Brazil and the store data there. And it was totally a nonsense for technical people because it really does not matter where the machine is for the purpose of the protection of the data. You can still transfer it easily anywhere, borderless. So there was this interesting situation there where there are a lot of technical people saying it makes no sense. But the government kind of have to say something because the Snowden revelations were really, they have a big impact in Brazil, especially in relation to Petrobras, the oil company, because we find out that they were really spying on that and on the very president email. So it was there was something that should be said to the people, but as far as I know, they have quietly abandoned the idea and nobody's mentioning it anymore.
Can I also add? No, because I find this discussion extremely interesting. Also, the German Telekom has made proposals to kind of shut our network a bit more. And I've seen an interesting discussion with a professor from California, actually. And there are a couple of interesting arguments. One is that the more you shut down the market, the less competition there is. And that typically leads into a lack of IT security. I mean, even if it was technically feasible. So, all what Rubens says back in mind, but even if it was technically feasible, it reduces, it centralizes the data. So this kind of facilitates attacking the data. It decreases the competition in IT security. And the third thing, and this is maybe the most important, if you think about espionage, think about XT score, which in the presentation was shown to have servers running in 200 countries of the world or something. I mean, then let's shut down all the connections of the internet outside Germany and have one NSA server in Germany, and the situation is the same again.
And just a quick follow-up, I think what this really is about too is there's an unhealthy situation at the moment in that almost all of the leading internet companies, the biggest ones, are US headquartered companies. And I understand that makes people, nervous. It would be better, and I think we have a much healthier situation with more competition if we had some leading internet companies in Europe and Asia and in Africa, etc. And so that's one of the things we should be trying to ask ourselves. Why don't we have any of these leading players are not EU-based companies? we need to work for that. It would be better for competition. It would be better probably for data security, and it would just be, I think, a healthier situation in general.
Yeah, back.
I would like to ask about the new proposal of cyber security, the directive, the proposal for the cyber security. There was Cyber Security Act in America, which was known with the title kill switch. I don't know if you're aware of it. The kill switch, where the President of the United States had the 14 days of cyber attack to shut down some of the how can I say that, some of the service providers to shut down some parts of the internet. And it was a very big deal for Americans because the society was very skeptical because they thought that it was just a way to invoke their fundamental rights. And others said that there is a very big danger for our cyber attack and that it could be devastation. And but we see that there is such a proposal in Europe. Do you believe that something like that is really a solution to the question of cyber security, or do you think that it really hides abuse for liberty? Mr. Hawellek,
Okay. No, I wasn't quite sure. I didn't want to take the word without being addressed directly. I think it's very hard to assess, actually. I mean, generally, I appreciate the efforts that we do in legislation to increase and enhance cybersecurity, but one has also needs to see, like, if you want only looks at the Cybercrime Convention, how much effort it was to establish it and how much it appears not to cover all the issues we would have needed to cover, and that we would like to review the Cybercrime Convention now again, and how difficult it is to do this on an international level, especially taking into account the ubiquity of the internet. One has to be aware, at least, that the effect which one can assume such a legislation can have will be very limited. But in the limited framework there is, I think it's of course important to think about that and to further develop the legal framework.
If I'm allowed the last word before the last part of the veil falls down, and that's a bad sign that we all have to go out of the room. At first, I would like to thank all the three presenters for the high quality presentations. I like today that we started with a more black message and we ended up with a more white message. That means that we have walked all the spectrum from blackness to whiteness, and we returned. I would like to take the opportunity to ask a question to Professor Kuner, that it is more technical in the sense of private international law. I very much liked, Professor Kuner, that you referred to the principle of country of origin, the territoriality that has conquered private international law. And I'm also very happy that you've mentioned the Google Spain decision, because if we combine that decision with other similar decisions of private international law nature, for example, the Palmer and Hawellek decision in the context of Brussels regulation, what the Court of the European Union was trying to do was trying to translate territoriality into the digital era. So, like Professor Menezes said, we didn't care where the technical infrastructure was, but we cared where the social consequences were actually present. So we were giving the law of this country. And in that context, I would like to ask you, how do you believe the proposal of the regulation adds to this effort of the Court of the European Union, especially under Article 3 of the proposal for the data protection regulation?
Well, to give a brief response to that, I think that the proposal of the regulation would expand a bit. Well, first of all, it would expand maybe a bit farther the extraterritorial jurisdiction of EU law. In the Google Spain case, the issue of the Article 4.1c about the use of equipment was raised, but the court never answered it because they said, we don't have to answer it. We've already found jurisdiction under basing on having establishment. So they never really went into that. I think also the proposal of the commission would be a little more coherent because I think everyone agrees the use of equipment now is just, it's almost become a legal fiction and it's not so meaningful. So the court, so this proposal would be a little more clear and coherent. I think there will be many issues of interpretation, but that's normal for any provision of private international law, and it will just have to be worked out through the courts.
Do you have any more questions? Did you not have a question at some point?
Why didn't you have any questions?
Thank you very much. Okay, I think in that case, I thank again all the speakers and our wonderful audience as well. We have a barbecue, I heard, just afterwards, so we can continue talking and exchanging ideas there. And thank you again for coming.
And thank you also to all the audience and to the former students which are also watching, which I see here on my laptop. So greetings to all over the world and thank you for staying with us.
Yeah, I'm seeing people on my phone. Nice to see you guys.